Now, a state of emergency is in force in southern Iceland after the fourth volcanic eruption since December.
Residents in the small town of Grindavik have evacuated the area around the Blue Lagoon geothermal spa. One of the country's most popular tourist destinations have also been closed. Lava flows cut off one road overnight, but they have since slowed down. And this latest eruption is believed to be the most powerful so far.
More extraordinary images over the weekend. Well, we're joined now to talk about this by Mike Burton, who's a professor of volcanology at the University of Manchester. Morning, Mike. Thanks for coming in. So what do we make of yet another eruption there? Well, yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating event. It's obviously critically difficult for the people who are living nearby. Yeah. And the news that this road has been cut is going to be difficult for people. But there seems to be just a steady magma supply feeding these eruptions. We've had one every month since December, January, February, and now March once again. This one was fascinating because there was a prediction a few days ago that the eruption would begin, but instead it actually paused and lava probably leaked out in the crust beneath the surface. But that allowed a larger volume of magma to accumulate. And now this eruption is going on slightly longer than before, but it is indeed waning now. And it wouldn't be surprising if by the end of the week, it's all finished.
And we can see these still very spectacular images coming in live right now.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's still going on very strongly, but this isn't quite as strong as it was at the beginning. When it opened up on the 16th, around 8:30, I think it was 8:23 that it actually opened. It was extremely strong, and the plume of gas, we measured it, seemed to go up to about 3 to 4 kilometres altitude.
So once a month for the last few months. How long could this go on for?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, this kind of zone, it's in the southwest of Iceland. It was last really active about 800 years ago. And at that point, it was active for about 30 years with sporadic, frequent eruptions. Again, of these quite small magnitude. So I'll be honest, I don't think we really know. We can't predict that much into the future. But certainly this sequence seems to be quite stable, and we can expect it to carry on doing the same thing for the next few months.
If we zoom out in terms of time, what does this mean?
Well, I think you have to look at the tectonic setting of Iceland, and then what we have is a couple of processes going on. In a way, this looks a lot like the extension of the mid-Atlantic spreading ridge, which is where...
Go on, what's that?
Tectonics, so we have tectonic stresses, which are spreading, and that's creating new crust, and that's a continuous supply of fresh magma coming up to the surface. And that's very much consistent with what we see here. It looks like a steady supply of magma coming up. And that's what's getting this regular activity. It takes about a month to accumulate, but then just a few days to release that pressure. And so then it resets and carries on again.
And being very, very selfish about this, is there any impact on that here in our atmosphere? Does it affect the UK in any way?
Well, it has done in the past. There was a very big eruption in 1783 in Laki, which definitely had a big impact on Northern Europe. And that's one of the main things that we volcanologists in the UK are looking at, is the potential risks which could be produced by a much bigger eruption. But there's no sign of that happening at the moment.
What sort of thing are we talking? Because we remember the ash cloud, don't we, as well, a few years ago?
From 2010.
Back in 1783 or whatever it was. What was the impact here then?
Well, it's difficult to understand exactly what the impact was, because obviously we don't have all the same tools we do now. But there are records of increases of mortality in the UK and also in France, and difficulties in agriculture because there was less sunlight coming through. So there was some real impacts coming through to that. Even some people attribute some of the problems with agriculture to what happened with the French Revolution, which followed on, which is a bit tenuous, but is a fascinating possibility.
In terms of Iceland, I mean, it's a country that's done really well out of what happens there. Tourism is booming there. How will this affect that industry?
Well, that's a great question. One critical point is that the airport has not closed, so you can still fly into Keflavik. And in general, in the past, there have been other options which were very accessible and people could kind of go there for tourism. This one's a bit more delicate because it's obviously so close to infrastructure, and no one wants to make a spectacle of someone's house being destroyed. So it's still, I think, one of the most impressive places to visit if you ever have the chance. It's an incredible place to see. And safe, completely safe, yeah. They're very good at controlling and making sure that the areas that people can access are well organised and completely secure.
Are you itching to get out there?
I'd love to. The problem we have is that the timescale for when we are sure the eruption is going to happen tends to be a few hours.
Wow.
And so by the time we get there, it's quite tricky. But there are teams who are already getting ready to anticipate when the next eruption is going to happen so that they can be there and catch it.
So that's a really good point, isn't it? How far in advance can you look ahead? You say you get a few hours warning. Is there not any way of extending that?
I think it's very complicated because you have, on one hand, very clear signals that there's an impending eruption, and that's mostly from the ground kind of expanding as the pressure increases. But then the actual moment when it chooses to erupt is dependent very much on the strength of the crust, and that's very, very locally dependent, and we don't actually have any way of measuring that. So for the time being, we just think that we can say there's a higher probability of an eruption in the next few days, and then exactly when it occurs, we can only see when it starts.
And for those of us who are not particularly au fait with the geography of Iceland, how big an area are we talking about that's affected by this? Are these volcanoes all in the same sort of close proximity? Or?
So there's been a kind of shift of the volcanic activity. So in 21, 22 and 23, there were activities a little bit further to the southwest. This has now moved a few kilometres, to 4 or 5 kilometres to the east and just northeast.
Quite close,
yeah, it's all quite centred around this Reykjanes Peninsula,
right,
which is in the southwest of Iceland. But these ones have been quite regularly in a very specific location just northeast of the town of Grindavik, but which fortunately has only been touched just on the edges so far.
Professor Mike Burton, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Fascinating.
Pleasure.